After more than 4 years of stalemate, the end of the Great War had come with a remarkable suddenness. One minute, millions of men had been desperately engaged in trying to kill one another, and then in the next they had simply laid down their weapons and stopped the bloodshed. When the fighting finally ended and the casualties tabulated, the numbers were staggering. In the course of the war, 10 million men in uniform had lost their lives, killed in battle, or died due to injuries or disease. In addition, 21 million more soldiers had been wounded or maimed during the Great War. In essence, an entire generation of European men had simply been removed from the face of the planet. Flying at the front had been a dangerous business during the war. Nearly 30,000 flyers had been counted as the casualties on both sides. History records Manfred von Richthofen, with 80 victories, as being the greatest ace of World War I. The second-ranked ace of the war was the Frenchman René Fonck, officially credited with destroying 75 German airplanes. The boastful ace had come through the conflict without so much as a scratch, and in the years following the war would remain active in aviation. Before his death in 1953, he would pen his autobiography, titled Ace of Aces, in which he personally claimed 125 victories. France, the nation that had given birth to the very first ace, had recognized 158 of its pilots as having shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. Third on the list, after René Fonck and George Guynemer, was Charles Nunguesser, called the indestructible ace after surviving 17 woundings in combat. Despite injuries that often called for the flyer needing to be lifted into and out of his cockpit, Nunguesser survived the war with an impressive 45 kills and continued to fly until 1927, when he disappeared attempting to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. Jean-Michel Nevers, the French ace who distinguished himself over the Battle of Verdun before spending the next 2 years in a mental hospital, was killed shortly after the war's end while practicing to fly under the Arc de Triomphe as part of an armistice celebration. The British had produced a total of 784 aces during the Great War. Billy Bishop, the Empire's top surviving scorer, with 72 victories, continued flying after the war and went on to start one of Canada's earliest commercial aviation companies in partnership with fellow countryman Raymond Barker. After surviving his dramatic fight against dozens of German machines in the closing weeks of the war, Barker, with 53 victories, had continued flying until a crash in 1930 claimed his life. Billy Bishop went on to serve again in the Second World War as an air marshal and would die peacefully in his sleep at home in Canada in 1956. Third on the list of British aces was Black Flight's Raymond Collishaw, who ended the war with 60 German machines downed. At the close of hostilities, Collishaw had remained in the Royal Air Force and, like fellow Canadian Billy Bishop, went on to serve in World War II. Further down the list was Andrew McKeever, the great Bristol two-seater ace who'd emerged victoriously 30 times in combat, only to die in an automobile accident barely a year after the end of hostilities. 363 German flyers qualified as aces, and it was the charismatic Ernst Udet who earned the distinction of being the fatherland's highest surviving scorer. Udet, with 20 victories at the time, had joined Manfred von Richthofen's Jagdgeschwader 1 a scant month before the famous Baron had been killed. Udet had gone on to blast 42 more Allied planes from the air. When von Richthofen's successor, William Reinhardt, was killed, command of the wing was briefly passed to Udet while a new permanent leader was selected. The last wartime commander of Jagdgeschwader 1 and Udet's new boss was a 25-year-old Bavarian flyer named Herman Goring. Goring would end the war with 22 confirmed victories and would, of course, later rise to the second highest position in the Nazi regime. Udet would distinguish himself between the wars as an aircraft builder, exhibition flyer, explorer, and photographer. When the Nazis came to power, he would go to work for Goring again, this time as a general involved in the technical development of fighter aircraft. In late 1941, when Goring began to use Udet as a scapegoat for failings within the Luftwaffe production system, the famed ace scrawled a note accusing his Reichsmarshal of betrayal and committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. For his part in the atrocities of the Nazi war machine, Goring would go on to cheat justice by himself committing suicide while awaiting judgment in a cell at the Nuremberg prison. Lother Von Richthofen, whom his brother had once dubbed the Butcher, ended the Great War with a final score of 40 enemy airplanes destroyed, exactly half the total victories his more famous brother had been credited with. Because of the periods he'd spent convalescing from wounds, Lother had accomplished his impressive victory tally with only 77 days of frontline service. The younger von Richthofen's military career had come to an end in August of 1918, on the occasion of his third serious wounding in battle. After the war, he continued flying until his death in a crash near Berlin in 1922. In 1925, the Red Baron's remains were brought home from France for a state funeral at Berlin's Invalidenz Cemetery. The Baron's aging mother was to become the chief caretaker of her son's memory. After the war, much of the family home in Breslau continued to house a museum featuring the Baron's collection of wartime trophies and memorabilia. In 1945, as the Soviet forces swept through Silesia on their way into the heart of the Reich, the Richthofen collection was crated up and shipped back to Moscow, where, presumably, it remains in storage to this day. Souvenirs collected from Manfred von Richthofen's Fokker triplane and his last flight were to make their way into dozens of private collections around the world. Shortly after the armistice, Anthony Fokker was to return home to Holland, where he once again set up an aircraft factory. The success of his D-7 fighter had been so great that the treaty at Versailles had specifically called for all examples of the plane to be turned over to the Allied forces, but Fokker had managed to smuggle a number of the machines back to Holland, where they became the basis of his new company. The post-war years would be good to the Flying Dutchman, with his tri-motored airliners becoming a mainstay of commercial aviation in the 1920s and 30s. America produced 118 aces of her own. Eddie Rickenbacker ended the war as America's ace of aces, 26 German machines having fallen before his guns. Almost immediately following the close of hostilities, Rickenbacker found himself caught up in a wave of public adoration, further sparked by the 1919 awarding of a Congressional Medal of Honor and the publication of his first book, Fighting the Flying Circus. Not content to rest on his laurels, Rickenbacker was to embark on a series of business ventures that included a line of luxury automobiles bearing his famous name and eventually becoming chairman of the board of Eastern Airlines, a company he built virtually from the ground up. During the Second World War, Rickenbacker was again to serve his country, performing important diplomatic work as an envoy to the Soviet Union. Eddie Rickenbacker died peacefully in a hospital bed in Zurich, Switzerland in 1973. James Norman Hall, the American journalist who had been swept into the great adventure and found himself serving, first with the Lafayette Escadrille and then finally with the Hat in the Ring Squadron, ended the war in a German prison camp. In the years that followed, Hall would go on to live on the South Pacific island of Tahiti, where he would author a great many books, including the famous Mutiny on the Bounty